Vice Chair Keller,
Present.
Commissioner King,
Present.
Commissioner Martinez, Chair Michael,
Present.
Commissioner Pinelli,
Present.
Commissioner Tanaka. 5 present, and both Commissioners Tanaka and Martinez said they wouldn't be here this evening.
Okay. And are there any announcements this evening?
The usual announcements are the next meeting will be October 9th, and tentatively scheduled for that evening is the transportation element, which was continued from August 28th, and the residential ADA parking program overview. And you will also need to elect or select somebody for council representation for the month of October. That's it.
So thank you. For October, the commission representative at City Council will be Commissioner Carl King. And then should we, I think for November, the representative will be Commissioner Pinelli.
Thank you.
Okay. So next we move to oral communications, which is the portion of the meeting when members of the public may speak to any item which is not on our agenda, given 3 minutes per speaker. And we reserve the right to limit oral communications period in total to 15 minutes. Do we have any speaker cards? All right. So moving ahead, let's open the public hearing. The first item is relates to 2080 Channing Avenue, which is a quasi-judicial matter. And it's a review of requests by Sandhill Property Company for our review and recommendation of 1, the certification of the final environmental impact report, and 2, an amendment to the planned community zoning for the Edgewood Plaza Shopping Center mixed-use project to allow for the reconstruction of one of the 2 historic Eichler retail buildings, which was inadvertently demolished. Now this is a quasi-judicial item, which leads me to ask my fellow commissioners if anyone has a disclosure to make regarding ex parte communications with the applicant. Before I do that, let me just note for the commission and those present what our policy is on ex parte communications. And that is that each commissioner who has had such contact with the applicant, which is communication outside of this public meeting, would make a verbal disclosure on the record of any relevant information that was which transpired in that communication. Or our policy permits the commissioner to make a very brief written summary of the discussion and make that available to the public. And we allow either mode of disclosure, but the verbal disclosure is sort of required. The written disclosure would be optional if necessary to clarify. So with that, does anybody have any disclosures to make with respect to this matter? Okay, there are none. So let's begin this with the report from staff.
Thank you, Chair. Elena Lee, Senior Planner with the Planning Division. So the purpose of today's hearing is to review the Edgewood Plaza PC amendment. Specifically, staff is requesting Commission's recommendation to the City Council on the adequacy of the final supplemental EIR that was prepared for the subject project and the planned community zoning amendment to approve the rebuilding of Building 1 with all new materials. All other components of the project are to remain the same. The subject was the site of a PC zoning to allow rehabilitation of an existing shopping center and the development of 10 new residential units, including a small park. The project included the relocation and renovation of one of the 2 retail buildings, including building number 1, that was deemed historic, and renovation of the other historic building, building 2, and renovation of the grocery building that was not deemed historic. A final environmental impact report was certified to provide environmental clearance, which assumed that all historic resources would be rehabilitated and therefore not create any significant impacts. The public benefit of the project were the preservation of the shopping center, 2 historic buildings, provision of a grocery store, electrical vehicle chargers, and a small park. The historic monument sign on the site was also to be rehabilitated and protected. In September 2012, a stop work order was issued because the historic building, Building 1, which was originally required to be relocated on site and rehabilitated, was meant to be rebuilt. It was demolished illegally. City Council authorized the continued construction of the project on March 4th, 2013, with the exception of the reconstruction of the demolished Building 1 and 4 of the homes. Since the authorization of council, the applicant has completed a renovation of the grocery building, and Fresh Market has occupied the site and is open for business. Although Building Number 1 will no longer be historic, the project is able to provide most of the required public benefits, especially the revitalization of a shopping center, the grocery store, the park, and the electrical vehicles chargers. So staff has also retained Carrying Company, the city's historic consultant for the original EIR, to review building permit plans and monitor construction of Building 2, the remaining historic building. Because the original FEIR assumed both buildings would be retained, the demolition of Building Number 1 would require new environmental clearance. A supplemental EIR, in accordance with the California Environmental Quality Act, was prepared for the revised project. The document was circulated for public review on May 17th for a 45-day circulation period. To date, staff has not received any comments about the project. Accordingly, staff has prepared a final supplemental environmental impact report confirming that no comments were received and no changes were made to the SCIR. That document has been released and circulated for at least 10 days. Staff is requesting PTC comments on the adequacy of the supplemental EIR and proposal to reconstruct Building Number 1. Staff would like to bring attention to one significant addition to the project. The city has required the applicant to replicate the original storefront window system, which is a distinct style that includes narrow full-height projecting moldings. This required custom-made windows that staff believes will help create a building that is significantly closer to its original appearance than would have been required for the original approval. The applicant has agreed to install these windows in Building Number 2 and will be required to do the same if Building Number 1 is approved to be reconstructed. Given the amount of storefront glass that would exist in Building Number 1, this represents a significant contribution to the Eichler character of the building. The other key component that staff would request Commission's recommendation on would be the topic of public benefits. The loss of Building Number 1 removed the project's ability to preserve one of the 2 historic buildings, which was one of the primary public benefits. The applicant is requesting that the addition of the custom windows, as well as other site improvements, which cost over $250,000 for both Buildings 1 and 2, be considered as public benefits. Staff has included in the staff report 2 potential public benefits for the Commission's consideration. One would be funding towards construction of sidewalks along West Bay Shore Road, as requested by some of the area residents and discussed at previous Commission hearings, or funding towards the restoration of a publicly owned historic resource such as the University Avenue Caltrain Station, to be later determined by Council. Because the historic resource was lost, staff recommends that a new public benefit be for historic preservation. Although the city does have a system in place for issuing fines for building infractions such as illegal demolition, the key issue for this project is a public benefit because of the laws of the historic building. Identification of an appropriate public benefit potentially provides a bigger benefit to the city, while allowing the city to clearly state that the provision of public benefits is important to the city and cannot be ignored. Staff has also identified a range of what the amount should be based on the city's established fine and typical practices by other cities. Copies of the August 24th Historic Resources Board staff report and draft excerpt minutes have been provided at places and is also available to the public. Vice Chair Roger Kohler is in attendance tonight to represent the HRB. At the August 21st hearing, the HRB unanimously voted to recommend that Council certify the SCIR and also approve the PC amendment. Also available tonight is the city's historic consultant Charlie Duncan and environmental consultant Nora Manette and Shannon George of Powers and Associates. They're available to answer questions. This concludes staff's report. Oh, and also the applicant John Zai is also in attendance to answer questions. Thank you.
Would the representative of the applicant have a statement that you'd like to add to the staff report?
Good evening. My name is John Zai, Sand Hill Property Company at 203 Redwood Shores Parkway in Redwood City. Thank you for taking the time, Chairman and members of the Commission. I apologize to have to bring this project back to you. Many of you have seen this over the years, and it's unfortunate that I have to take your time to do this. I thank the staff for the report. I think was very thorough. I imagine some of you may be wondering what exactly happened, and so if I'm going to take a minute, I'll just walk you through in my own words what I think maybe in the back of some of your minds as everybody asks. Over the course of the project entitlements, and once we've got approvals, we regularly walk the site with our consultants, and one of those were the historic consultant that we had hired. This walk included myself, my construction team, which is my project manager and contractors. And so after getting the consultant's recommendations or opinions, I was like the neighbors, surprised when I heard from the neighbors that the building came down. I think my construction team, and I take responsibility as they are my team, came to their own reasoning and jumped the gun. That's essentially what happened. I don't think there was no malintent. I think it was just an error on my team's part, and we're trying to rectify it. When we were made aware of a possible way to make the buildings more historically significant by rebuilding the storefronts, the wood storefronts, with much more detail, we opted to go ahead and do that to try to make amends for our mistake. I'll be available for questions, and basically that's, I think, what happened. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Do we have any speaker cards? Are there any members of the public who have indicated? Okay, we have. Oh, so you can bring up the speaker card. And in the meantime, does anybody from the Commission want to ask a question of the applicant? Vice Chair Keller.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your apology. It's an unfortunate situation. I'm wondering, are there some comments in the staff report about the expenditure that you put in terms of improving the windows beyond what for the building that is remaining, to make them, is that correct, to make them more consistent with the original style?
Yes, I think there are figures that I provided Elena as to what it costs to, rather than take an off-the-shelf wood storefront, we have actually had a team of carpenters out there building it on site. And so that cost for both buildings was about $250,000. So building one's a little bit larger than the building that we're just finishing up and about to paint. So if you maybe break it up 45% of that 250.
And I'm wondering, you know more about this than I do, so I'm wondering whether the life of the building that you're building from scratch, in terms of being built with modern materials and modern insulation, modern wiring to code and all that kind of stuff, without having to rebuild it, whether that would have a value of the fact that it's in some sense new construction as opposed to having to retrofit the existing building?
Well, we've just gone through a rehabilitation of Building 2, the one that you might see right next to the Fresh Market, and very little of it was actually salvageable. In fact, under the guidance of Charlie Duncan, we and the architects and structural engineers agreed what should and should not be kept, as far as even the large glulam beams. The original building, I can't tell you exactly what kind of aged buildings are designed, but what I've heard from architects and engineers is generally those buildings may not have been designed for more than 30 to 50 or 60 years. And so what we discovered in the building that was illegally demolished is, to our surprise, not much of the material was actually original of the observable facade. When we peeled that away and showed our consultants, we were actually surprised by how little original material there was. And what original material there was a lot of it was found objectionable by our structural engineer from simply you could actually put a pencil into the glulam beams that were supposed to be reused, and so he didn't want to reuse any of those buildings. So anyways, a new building should have a life of at least 50 years. It is still a wood structure building, but obviously to current seismic code, current Title 24 green building requirements, et cetera.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions of the applicant? Commissioner King.
I will ask, there's also reference to technical modifications that have increased the cost to the traffic signal upgrade and the 3 car chargers. Could you address that? And I'd ask you and may I ask staff as well, do we have verification of the funds expended?
Sure. The staff does not have verification, but I can provide that. I think maybe it was mischaracterized as technical upgrades, but the traffic signal was maybe estimated by some staff members to be a certain dollar amount, and it turns out it's not. It's quite a bit more. So the $200,000 is basically what the replacement traffic signal. That's not the intersection work or road work, just the electric signals section, and 3 car charger and the affiliated power that Commissioner Keller very well knows about. In our case, we saved a lot of money on the chargers themselves because actually a provider called Blink provided the actual level 2 and level 3 chargers, but we just had to put the infrastructure in for them. And so that's where the $200,000 came from. But it's not a technical difference. It was basically maybe an inaccurate estimate by some people early on.
And so is your argument that you relied upon those numbers in your initial? Oh.
No, I'm not arguing that.
Okay, so I'm just a little, so if in fact the request is to, I guess it appears here that you're requesting that we might consider that a public benefit, the expenses incurred for the chargers and the traffic signal.
The expense was just to quantify what it cost. That was what was asked of me. But my opinion is the chargers, in my view, is a benefit to the public. Putting that revised traffic signal in along with the restriping will be a benefit. It wasn't a requirement by transportation, but it was more, it's inconvenient making a left-hand turn going westbound on to St. Francis. I've experienced it, I'm sure you all have, because the exiting traffic is sometimes moving at 50 miles an hour towards you.
Yes.
And so it was suggested that we replace that. And all I'm saying is an estimate by a staff member at the time was very low compared to what it really cost. But I'm not saying that that's I'm not trying to make an extraordinary case for that being a public benefit.
Okay, but those expenses were discretion on your part. Is the change to the traffic signal and the car charges were discretion on your part and not part of the original requirements for the project?
I don't think they're discretionary. I think they were part of the project conditions of approval.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I just had one question of staff, and that is, it appears that there's no dispute about the fact, and I think that that's all for you.
Thank you.
So thanks very much. But there isn't any dispute about the fact that Building 1 was demolished illegally, and for which we've received an apology from the applicant. However, the question is what are the consequences of that? And under the applicable provisions of the city code, when there's I suppose this is analogous to a building permit violation or a zoning code violation, but in fact this is a planned community zone which was granted in exchange for, in part because of the public benefit that would be provided as a result of proceeding with this project. And the public benefit here had multiple elements, one of which was the preservation of the historic structure that was illegally demolished. So do we have any guidance to give the commission in terms of, one, what our purview is as a commission, and what are the applicable standards for a a penalty or a remedy for the illegal demolition of this building in the planned community zone, which abrogates the part of the public benefit.
Yes, thank you, Chair Cara Silver, Senior Assistant City Attorney. There are two issues here. One is the penalty procedure, and there is a penalty for demolishing a building in violation of the building permit and other entitlements. And unfortunately, our penalty structure is very low in connection with that. And so the information in the staff report shows that it's about $5,000 for a penalty. And so I think that staff thought, and at the city council hearing when this issue came up the first time around, the sense was that that penalty was really not sufficient. Now, because this is a PC, it is possible to try to satisfy or assess an appropriate penalty through the PC process. And it is also appropriate in the PC process to because one of the primary community benefits in this case was the historic demolition, or was the historic retention of this building. It is appropriate to come up with a substitute for that community benefit. So there are two issues in front of the commission at this point. One is whether the penalty is appropriate, and second, whether the community benefit is appropriate at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have one speaker card. Let's open it up to that.
The speaker is Gail Olson, and by the way, after we hear from the public, the applicant will be allowed to speak later. Thank you.
Good evening and thank you. I'm Gail Olson. I live at 715 Wildwood Lane, which is right around the corner from the shopping center. I've lived there with my husband for 46 years. Needless to say, we have been through many difficulties with the Edgewood Shopping Center over these years. We've attended numerous meetings to plan what to do about the shopping center. So when this was finally approved, I was thrilled, the neighborhood was thrilled, and when the Fresh Market opened, it was a glorious day. So I'm here to speak in favor of moving forward with this project and getting the rest of the shopping center completed. There will be additional services, there'll be shops, hopefully a restaurant with some pizza parlors and that sort of thing. The neighbors are all enthusiastic. We have elderly people in the neighborhood who are not able to drive anymore, so this is a benefit for them. So I would urge you to move forward and approve the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other speakers from the public? Well, seeing none.
Around the questions or ask the HRB person.
Do we have a representative from the HRB here this evening? And would you like to elaborate on any of the issues that are presented here based on your hearing?
Yes, good evening. I'm Roger Kohler, Vice Chair of the Historic Resources Board. We reviewed this project a couple weeks ago, and we also reviewed it, of course, when it first came through. We found that there was some suggestion during the meeting that instead of rebuilding this structure was to do an entirely different looking structure, because there was thought that this was not, it shouldn't be duplicating because it's not a historic structure. But we all felt unanimously that the proposed program would be far more appropriate and would continue the feel and the look of the historic shopping center over having a totally different looking building there. The truth is that, having worked on a lot of homes myself and things, that refurbishing historic homes, there's a lot of existing structure that's there and everything, but in the end it looks brand new because it's all been new paint and fixed up and it looks very good. So I think in the end this building, I think from the inside as well, it'll be obvious this is a new structure. From the exterior, I think it's going to fit in and look like the existing building that is there. And the building that's also being refurbished is also going to look brand new as well because it's being refurbished from top to bottom. So that was our feeling, and that was one of the few discussions we had about the structure. Other than that, we approved of the project as it was presented.
So thank you very much. Does anybody on the commission have questions of, excuse me, I didn't catch your name.
Roger Kohler.
Of Roger Kohler. Vice Chair Keller.
Let him go first.
Okay. Commissioner King.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Kohler. You may decline to answer these, but you've had a history of probably doing hundreds of new construction and remodels in the city of Palo Alto. So do you have any rough guess of what the applicant might have saved in costs by tearing down the property and being able to build without having to remodel?
Well, this building was being moved because it was part of the reason that the shopping center failed, in a lot of the opinion of the board members, was the random orientation of those two structures. When you drove in, you saw the one unit and the other was around the corner. So once like today, when you walk into even Safeway, new parking lot in Mountain View, you can see all the structures and you get an obvious, oh yeah, there's that store, there's that store. But on Edgewood Market, when you pulled into the Lucky store, the other unit was behind the other one store. So you weren't always aware that it was there. I mean, my office is in Colorado, and I used to go over there to get pizza for lunch all the time. But I think the arrangement of it is going to make the whole shopping center work a great deal better. I mean, I'm not sure I'm answering your question. But
yeah. Well, my one question is,
in the end, I think, yeah, they might be saving some money, but because they were moving the building anyway, I think some of that cost is somewhat negligible. But
okay. And the reason I asked the question is that I think, in my mind, one of the primary things we want to move forward with is to ensure that we do not provide incentives and that we actually provide a disincentive for people to break terms of a development agreement, such that there could be an argument made, if the applicant would save X, pick a number, $500,000 in costs by tearing down the building and starting from scratch versus rehabilitating the existing building, then it makes sense to have some penalties or public benefits that are commensurate with savings.
I suppose there's a project on University Avenue where they sort of just dismantled the whole house, and we're going to do things different than were on the approved plans. But unfortunately, when they dismantled the home, they kept a very good record of all the little pieces, the siding and everything. So the reassembled building is looking very close to the original because a good part of the materials are still being used, although a lot of the actual structure is new. So I would say that the preferred option, and that's why since I know in the mid-80s or so, we do more new homes than remodelings in my little business, in part because a lot of the older homes just are really failing. The foundations are no good, and with the new zoning ordinance and everything, it's just usually easier to do a new home. In this case, I think they may have saved some money. I wouldn't say it's dramatic myself, because it's just construction. I mean, maybe if they've been able to keep all the glulam beams, the cost of the glulam beams might have been some dimension, but I just don't think it's that much myself.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Keller.
Thank you. Did the HRB consider at all whether or not there should be any penalties applied to the applicant in this project, or was that not within the purview of the HRB?
I might defer that to Stephen. I don't actually remember that we talked about anything like that. We don't normally get into that kind of discussion.
If I may, that was not a question that we brought to the HRB. The HRB's role and what we requested of them specifically was on the EIR and the historic resource impact of the project.
Thank you. And in terms of the historic resources impact of the project, I understand that because the building was demolished and is being rebuilt, that is a significant but unavoidable impact. Is that right, of the project, the destruction of the building and rebuilding of it? Is that right?
I'm not exactly sure. It's basically an impact. The building's being rebuilt. Now, the impact on the shopping center itself is probably going to be negligible because it's all going to look like the original structure. And that was one of the reasons why we weren't in favor of doing a totally different looking building. So you'd have two older looking buildings and suddenly this new structure. So if that's what you're asking. I'm seeing other people here want to say.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I was just going to note the EIR-related questions. You could probably ask staff because we may be able to answer those.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger.
I'm not good at answering EIR questions.
Commissioner Alcheck?
Yeah, just I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak to this or staff, but is there any precedent for this situation? I mean, in your experience or on maybe any of the current members of the HRB's experience, have you ever been in a situation where
in consulting with multiple staff members, this is the first time something like this has happened in the city, especially for a PC project. We've had situations where historic buildings were demolished, but in one case in the downtown, the materials were preserved, and so they're able to reconstruct it. In this case, not enough of the building remained in order to allow reconstruction. Staff also surveyed cities around the Bay Area to see if this has happened, and this is a very rare occurrence.
I guess I can chime in. I guess next year begins my 20th year as a HRB member. So I can list, when I walk down University, there's a whole number of buildings we've looked at in over town. I don't think we've ever encountered where we've approved a reworking of an historic structure and to have it torn down. So.
Okay. So now we'll come back to the commission, and as we've done in the past, first, if there's a round of any questions to clarify the matter, and then we'll have sort of comments, perhaps based on a motion.
Well, actually, before the motion, we have the clarifying questions, then the applicant, then motions.
Okay, and then we'll have an opportunity for the applicant to make a final statement. So, to the commission, for any questions that you have about the matter. Commissioner Pinelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for staff on actually the slide that's up there right now, slide 8. There are a couple ideas for additional public benefits, one being a contribution toward the West Bay Shore sidewalk improvement, the other being toward the restoration of a historic building. Does staff have a recommendation of what the size of that contribution should be?
That's been a difficult question for staff. We've looked at the penalty structure that we have in the city, which is fairly low amounts as shown in the staff report. And when we surveyed other cities for destruction or demolition of historic buildings or some impact on historic structures, most of that has been doubling to tripling of the fees, which again is shown in the staff report as what that range could be. As an alternative, staff has said you could also just apply a percentage based on the valuation, and staff has also raised the valuation because we understand that there's significant costs incurred in the project as part of this. Mm-hmm. So That's something that we're really looking to the commission to provide, but we do have a range in there. It would be between $10,000 up to $942,000.
Okay. I guess, let me phrase it differently then, the question. How much, for example, what's the total budget required for the West Bay Shore sidewalk improvement?
It's estimated right now to be about $144,000.
Okay. And the contribution towards restoration of a historic building, I'm assuming that's for a future unknown, so you'd have to just pick a number and hope that it satisfies whatever future project.
That's correct.
Okay. Can you remind me what the total square footage of this building is? I know it's in the staff report, but is it?
It is about 10,000 square feet.
Okay, just for this building. Okay.
Just building one, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner King, do you have any clarifying questions?
Yes. So I'd ask of staff of the same regarding the sidewalk project. I mean, I don't get a sense being able to read between the lines on whether this is a project we feel really fits in with our long-term plans, or whether it's just, hey, here's something we could throw money at, even if we don't think it's a great use for the money. It's someplace to put money, even though it may not be the most optimal solution. Could you address that, please?
Sure, thank you. So basically, this improvement came up as part of the overall discussion during the original PC, and when the neighbors brought that up, city did recognize that that was a deficiency in our sidewalk system, and so it's been identified in our bike pedestrian master plan as a deficiency that should be corrected, and so it is a project or improvement that the city would support.
And I may be missing it. Is there a graphic of where that exists, where we're talking about?
It would be basically from, there's no graphic on there, although if you look on your the site plan, it's basically West Bayshore Road from north of the site all the way to the East Palo Alto border. So it would be basically the left-hand side, the one opposite from the freeway. Right now, it's really some dirt paths, and then so the proposal would be to add a sidewalk where those dirt paths currently are.
And that's beginning at Channing Avenue?
Yes. Well, north of Channing.
North, beginning at Channing, headed north.
Yes.
And how far would that go?
I don't actually have the footage, the distance, but it would be all the way to the East Palo Alto border.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then, let's see, do I have another question? No, I think that's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Alchak, did you have any clarifying questions? Okay, so at this point, maybe we can open the floor for a motion, and then... Vice Chair Keller is keeping me honest, and I'd like to invite the applicant back to make a statement, if you like, for 3 minutes.
It's not a final statement, Marcellus. I just wanted to clarify a few things, because after this happened, when I finally got a hold of my contractors, asked them what happened, there were a few things that contribute to their confusion and mistake. One is there was a demo permit issued for this building, because the city doesn't have a deconstruction permit or a relocation permit. That permit did exist, and to your question, Commissioner King, as far as the condition of the building when it was reviewed and opened up was such that you didn't want to reuse those materials. If you try to reuse it, the inspector would tell you to replace it. There was that much damage in dry rot and so forth in most of the building materials. So I just want to point those things out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll turn back to the commission for a motion and for any other comments. Commissioner King?
Yeah, so I guess on the comment section, I watched the council when they addressed this, and I think they, as I believe we maybe find ourselves, are, perplexed. There's no track record. It's a very rare occurrence as far as how you would penalize or, it's penalizing the applicant for the error made, which at face value was unintended. And in my mind, I think we're ending up with a superior building that will last longer and probably safer, certainly more habitable for the tenants. So, although that decision should have, of course, been made during the initial process. And I know at the time, there were many members of the public who were saying, that's an old beat-up building. And in fact, with that style of architecture, there's not much there. That, it's some windows. There just isn't a lot of structure, right? It's like a Eichler Homes. And so I think it's very hard to decide what is the appropriate penalty. I think, as I mentioned before, the key thing is that you want some disincentive for this to ever happen again. And yet, the odds of the stars aligning where this could even happen seems pretty rare. And so I really don't want to make it an unreasonable burden on the applicant. And yet, again, we don't want that to become a par for the course for developers to say, hey, it's just cheaper for me to break the agreement and pay the penalty. So I have to say, I don't know where to really start as far as proposing a dollar amount that would then be converted into funds to the city or general fund or to specific projects. So I'm anxious to see if any of the other commissioners have a sense of that. Obviously, I believe staff may have made an error in saying $942,000. I think it was $94,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you. It's actually between, so basically the $942,000 would be the adjusted valuation. And so if we use the 10%, it'd be $91,200 to $94,200. And on the other hand, also if we did a doubling or tripling of the building permit fees, which is a pretty standard fine used by other cities in the area, that would be between $13,680 and $28,260. So that would be more in line with what other cities have done, but because this is a PC, the city does have the leeway to make that a different number, because the question that we're focused on here also is not just, what is the violation that was done, but also ultimately what is the best public benefit that's appropriate given the situation and given the needs of the city.
Thank you. And so, I guess if I were just trying to put some numbers in there, a fine in the $10,000 to $100,000 range, it could be argued. Again, I don't know. Mr. Kohler didn't really have a offhand back of the envelope of what the applicant might have saved. And again, maybe he didn't save anything, but I would expect that not having to try and recreate the building, moving pieces of that type of construction, that there were some material savings, and maybe we want to ask the applicant. I won't ask him at this point, but those are my thoughts. And I'm sorry, no motion is popping out from this commissioner at this point. Okay. Thank you.
So at this point, let me just observe that often before the Planning and Transportation Commission are applications for planned community zoning. In connection with approving the PC zone ordinance, it's incumbent upon the Commission to determine the adequacy of the public benefit that would result from the project. And here, and we also have had in the community some concern about the PC zoning process. It was observed that the criticism is that oftentimes the public benefits are arguably inadequate, and then in the end, they might not actually be delivered. So I think that situation is not what we're looking at tonight, just to be perfectly clear. And I've also, from up here this evening, I've been very impressed with the candor and the sincerity of the applicant in acknowledging the facts, what happened, and that it wasn't intended, and their efforts to bring about a practical way forward, which was also part of the record in front of the Historic Resources Board. So as we're dealing with sort of a matter that there isn't a well-established precedent in Palo Alto for the penalty that the council will impose, I think that we should put forward sort of a recommendation for the council in terms of what would be a reasonable amount of a monetary penalty, perhaps in line with the standard suggested by staff. But I think that the important policy issues that we face in considering public benefits in connection with PC zoning generally, that's not the issue we're facing tonight. There is an aspect of the nature of the benefit relative to the historic building demolition, but the fact that it's been rebuilt or is in the process of being rebuilt with attention to the proper detail and whatnot is duly noted. So perhaps one of our colleagues in the commission will come forward with a motion for our recommendation to council and our action on the two issues that we have. Interim Planning Director Ackman.
If I could help out with this, I think after taking a look, and this is obviously a difficult one for staff too, because it's hard to quantify this. When I'm taking a look at this, I'm taking a look at what public benefit was lost, and obviously it was the historical aspect of this. I think just talking briefly, and speaking to other cities, I think tripling of the fine, which would come out to about $28,000, and then putting that towards some type of historic, some type of fund to help rehabilitate a historic public structure would be something that would be adequate in this case.
Commissioner Alchek?
So is there precedent where we were consulted on fine amounts in past transgressions, not tear downs of historical so-and-so? Like, I'll give you an example of why I'm asking, because this isn't the first quote-unquote public benefit that didn't turn out the way it should have. And I don't know if we've gone back and investigated other public benefits which we feel have not been provided the way they may or may not have been agreed to be provided. To the extent that that's the topic we're talking about, I feel like, is this something we've done in the past? Is it something we want to start doing? To the extent that this is an act that violated, let's say, a permit, is there a precedent for Planning Commission to kind of weigh in on the fine someone would get for violating a permit? Do you see what? There's sort of two different.
Yeah, the answer is no. I mean, I think you're hitting it right there. Is we're kind of mixing and matching two things. There's the fine, and then there's the public benefit amount. In this case, what we're saying is, a fine would typically be brought down by staff to an applicant. But since we're part of a PC zone right now, what we're saying is to pay an equivalent amount as part of the public benefit, so that fine could be put towards a specific purpose, which in this case would be rehabilitation of a publicly owned historic building.
I'm not putting forward the motion at this time, but I would suggest that if we evaluate the loss of a public benefit, or if we begin, that's sort of a can of worms there, the notion that the public benefit's value has been lost, and so we're going to get involved in remedying the that loss, because there's a lot of potential public benefits that we may want to look at that that similarly didn't meet the expectation or direction of the Planning Commission, and I'm not sure that's what we want to do tonight, or if that's, I don't know. To the extent that there should be a fine assessed for the failure of the applicant to comply with the permit he was given, if there was a motion to essentially defer to the City Council, I would be in favor of that. I sort of think that there's sort of two unspoken, or I guess subtle messages here. If the City Council, I'm assuming they'll review this, if the City Council determines that the failure to provide the public benefit is, or failure to essentially deliver the public benefit as promised is so significant that the fine has to be severe, that would go a long way to bolstering the notion that the City Council is behind this idea of public benefits. If the City Council decides to essentially assess a fine for failure to adhere to the permit, that's sort of different, because people will fail to comply with specific permits in the future, and they may or may not have anything to do with the public benefit scenario. And so, again, I don't think we've ever been in a situation where we're tasked with enforcing the receipt of public benefits. And so to a certain extent, I'm uncomfortable with beginning to do that, because in the past, on this commission, I've heard commissioners state that the public benefits that were supposed to occur didn't occur, and I would then query as to, well, why don't we open that back up? And figure out why that public benefit has not been provided the way you intended, and if it didn't, let's assess some fine for it. Since we haven't gone there in the past, and I'm not sure that's where we want to go, I don't know if we should be essentially weighing in too heavily on specific fine amounts. If this is an issue about assessing a fine for permit noncompliance, I think the city's got a pretty standard formula, and since we're not actively involved in the enforcement of those sorts of issues, I don't really know if we have to be any more involved than to suggest that the City Council review this matter in light of the situation and enact the standard procedure for assessing a fine for permit noncompliance. So there's sort of two big issues here, and in both cases, I'm sort of inclined to suggest that we defer to City Council with the suggestion that they pay particularly close attention to the notion that if they don't deal with this in a way, they're going to set a precedent for the value we're actually placing in our public benefit analysis if you could essentially avoid the delivery. So that's convoluted, but I'd like to hear what you guys think about that.
Commissioner Pinelli?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to suggest that, building off of what the chairman said before, that this PC is not controversial like some of the others, because this is something that the neighborhood actually really wants. And I'd argue that the folks who've been penalized the most are probably the neighbors. I am very sensitive, though, to the comments that Commissioner King mentioned, which is we've got to provide some kind of a disincentive to the old adage that it's easier to ask for forgiveness afterwards than to ask for permission beforehand. So what I'd suggest is, and I'm going to disagree with you, Commissioner Alchek, about deferring to council. I think council appointed us to this body to ease their load in some way, and so the more that we can demonstrate some leadership, I think the more valuable we are to council. So I would say, let's suggest something. They're more than welcome to agree or add to it or subtract from it. But I think we can put forward some rationale as to, a specific proposal. I think at this point, I'd like to make a recommendation, a motion, that we recommend that council approve this, let's see, what's the best way to phrase this? This amended planned community for supplemental EIR under the condition that they contribute for the West Bayshore sidewalk improvement. To me, there's a direct, because this is a connector to this, ostensibly to this shopping center, I think it's a benefit to the community because I think it allows them to perhaps walk more safely than what it is available today if they were to try to walk down West Bayshore. I'm hesitant towards this contribution towards restoration of a historic building because to me there's no direct relationship other than the ideas that we were supposed to be historically preserving something. It didn't happen, but I don't see any connection to a historic preservation opportunity in that part of town. So I'd rather see a project, a public benefit that actually benefits that part of town directly. And barring a better idea, that one seems like the best one on the table. So that would be my motion.
Just as a clarification, did you have an amount for the contribution?
The 144, I mean, whatever the estimated cost was.
Planning Director Ackman.
One thing sorry for late breaking news, but we just received an email from our transportation staff. I had asked them to go out there and actually measure to figure out if any parking spaces would be lost as a result of the sidewalk being put in. And I'm reading the email now that up to 10 parking spaces could be lost if the sidewalk is put in now. They're not legally, they may or may not be legal spaces, but they're functioning as spaces and historically have been functioning as spaces along there near the East Palo Alto border. So just to throw another monkey wrench into everything, there could potentially be a loss. Now, you could amend your motion for us to take a look at that and provide that as part of our information to City Council. That could be one way of going about it, because this is just a preliminary email, but since I have the info, I want to relay it to you.
Commissioner Alchek had a question?
Yeah. This is going to come off wrong, but this sidewalk serves residents of Palo Alto or residents of East Palo Alto?
It's both.
Because I'm a little confused about that, because it looks like it would serve residents of East Palo Alto, not that that isn't a worthy cause. It's just, I think, relevant to the discussion. Can anybody provide some clarity there? Where is the border?
Commissioner King?
Yeah, I have I can pass this along. Unfortunately, I don't, someday soon we'll be able to project it up there. I have Google Maps here, and I'll describe what I see, which is that from Channing along 101, along West Bayshore, to, I believe the city of Palo Alto ends at the creek, correct? That's yes. Our border. There are no houses that appear to face from the houses on Edgewood back to West Bayshore. There appear to be no residences or structures through to the creek, which would be the border with East Palo Alto, and then there's that apartment complex there that has sidewalks in front of it, and then it goes to the intersection at Woodland, and from there north, it appears there are no sidewalks, and that there is street parking where sidewalks might be. And so I'll pass this along to if commissioners would like to take a look at that. And so I'll just.
Do you know if the parking spots he was talking about are those near that apartment complex?
maybe Aaron could address that. I'm not seeing any parking spaces near Channing. I'm seeing parking spaces near Woodland.
I guess my question is, are those East Palo Alto, are those parking spaces that residents of East Palo Alto are using that we would be?
Well, we're not sure exactly who uses those parking spots, but the parking spots, as Aaron had described, are in Palo Alto. It's just they're informal parking spaces where vehicles, people are parking their vehicles on basically dirt areas. So they're not paved, but they're just wide enough for cars to park.
So I have a question of Commissioner Pinelli, and maybe this is in the form of a friendly amendment to your motion, and that is, I guess, for all the factors that you articulated in making the motion, I wonder if we should try to provide some just clarity in our recommendation to council that the amount of the penalty should be some multiple of the permit amount, say 3 times the permit amount, and that it should be contributed towards the purpose stated, which is towards a portion of the cost of the West Bay Shore sidewalk improvement when that project is implemented. So would that be accepted as a friendly amendment to your motion?
Yes.
Is there a second?
I'd like to propose another one.
Commissioner Alcheck?
I just want to throw in, I mean, again, I to some extent wish we could defer, but if we're going to make a recommendation, I sort of would prefer that the contribution went towards the restoration of a historic building, because this sidewalk to nowhere, essentially, is what I will call it, seems like a complete waste of money. I'm worried that it doesn't serve our residents, and to some extent, it seems more fitting that the monies raised or assessed will go to the very cause that was not met here, right? The restoration of a historic building. Seems like the second concept would be more apt. But.
Vice Chair Keller.
Thank you. So firstly, I think that there are 2 additional presumably public benefits that have apparently already been done, which were not included in the original public benefits. And one of those, which is arguable, is the restoration of the storefront windows of Building 1 and 2 to the original appearance as designed by the architect. The second thing is the improvement of the traffic signal, which was not originally public benefit, and that I'm not sure if that was that a public benefit or not, because it wasn't.
It was a condition of approval.
It was a condition of approval.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's for the clarification. So it seems to me that I'm aligned with Commissioner Pinelli that there should be some sort of penalty. I'm aligned with Commissioner Alcheck that the direct cost, if you will, the loss, was in historic resources, and therefore any penalty should be applied to historic rehabilitation of resources in Palo Alto. The thing that's interesting to me about this is that the sidewalk construction on West Bayshore, although I have no problem with benefiting the people of the apartment or condo complex in East Palo Alto who came and spoke to us, I think that that's a worthy thing to consider doing. The issue is that construction might further annoy the neighbors because it's actually happening behind the houses that are in Palo Alto on Edgewood Drive. And so I'm not sure if that construction would be desired by them or not desired by them. So without getting their input, I don't know, I have trouble recommending that that be done. And I'm guessing that my suggestion would be probably considered too high, but I'm going to say it anyway. So, but first let me say that we should probably have in our ordinance, we have this informally, but it may not be an ordinance to require that there be no demolition without a new building permit, and that would have prevented, for example, the loss of the historic property at the Juan Briones house that happened because of inadequate, and there were also destructions of houses that were not replaced by anything in Professorville, I believe. People just wanted vacant land, and that's a problem. And also, we should actually have a law that basically creates a penalty in case of illegal demolition and other things like that, so that this would be clarifying. But it seems to me that there's actually two things going on. There's actually two infractions. One infraction is demolition in violation of the building code, that they're supposed to have not demolished the building but move it. And I realize that technically there was a demolition permit issued to move it, but that's kind of an arcane thing. The second thing is that there's a loss of public benefit, which is the public benefit of having this historic building there. There is a new historic building in its place, which is, according to the Historic Resources Board, better than replacing it with a building that looks out of place. But in some sense, that's a loss of resources. So I don't know if I'll get a second, but my suggestion is, my motion is to recommend approval to the City Council of the Supplemental Environmental Impact Report, to amend the Planned Community Ordinance to add to the benefits, one, restoring windows of buildings 1 and 2, storefront windows of building 1 and 2 to the original appearances designed by the original architect, and two, a $500,000 contribution to historic rehabilitation of some buildings in Palo Alto, one or more buildings in Palo Alto, with that amount covering both the penalty of the illegal demolition as well as the loss of the historic resource.
So there's a substitute motion by Vice Chair.
Not substitute. The first motion died, so it's another new motion.
There's a new motion by Vice Chair Keller. Is there a second?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the penalty amount?
The penalty amount as recommended was $500,000. And basically, the idea there is that that's significant enough to deter people from violating PC ordinances at this stage. And it goes towards historic rehabilitation. And also, the issue is, I do think that we should be enforcing in some ways public benefits that we don't get.
Can I make a friendly amendment to your motion?
Sure.
I am inclined to support everything, all of the elements of your motion other than the penalty amount, which I think under the circumstances and facts outlined this evening is significantly higher than I would have thought reasonable. And I would recommend that the penalty amount be at the high end of the range in the staff report, which ranged from $10,000 to $94,000. So I think if we have a recommendation being for the high end of the range from the planning department, I would support your motion.
Okay. I'll accept your friendly amendment of the high end, which was, I guess, $94,000 approximately.
Correct.
Thank you.
So anyway, so I'm going to second the motion, and then Commissioner Alczak would like to make a friendly amendment.
Okay, I'm just going to throw this out there again, which is that we operate with I would prefer to operate with the fine amount that was typical in the city for, I would call it permit infractions, which is 3 times the permit fees. And the reason why I would prefer to do that is because since there is no current process for us to somehow enforce the PC requirements on developers after the fact, at least I'm not aware of one if there is, it's as if it's as if we're trying to get that all out right here, because it's so abhorrent to us that the PCs that the public benefits that we attempt to negotiate, if you will, in some cases are not achieved, that we would really want to discourage anyone from ever doing something like that again. At the same time, we can't go back and fix the ones that we don't think are being properly provided now, and I'm not sure we'll be able to. Our role is not to enforce the delivery of those public benefits that have been negotiated already, and so I sort of would prefer that we use this 3 times amount of the permit process, because then we can say, well, this situation, we dealt with it in the standard permit fine process, as opposed to public benefit analysis process.
So does Vice Chair Keller accept Commissioner Alczyk's friendly amendment?
With all due respect, I don't accept your friendly amendment. The reason being that we're actually dealing with 2 things: the violation of the code rule, for which the 3 times rule might make sense, but the additional amount is for the loss of the public benefit that was in the original PC.
Chair Michael, if I could just interject for one moment, just to clarify, we do have a code enforcement process for violations of a PC ordinance that has already been approved by the council. What makes this situation a little bit awkward is that while the ordinance was approved, the construction was midstream, and so the community benefits had not entirely been provided at this point. So we treat this violation really as a building permit violation as opposed to a PC code enforcement violation.
Commissioner Alczyk?
I'm just sort of curious. If a development was supposed to provide a certain space for public use, and it not only failed to provide that space, but the space was sort of commandeered for private benefit use, is there any enforcement process that would allow this commission to assign a value to that public space and ask that applicant after the fact to pay into a general fund or in a park fund or something?
I see what you're saying. No, we would, that type of issue would be handled at an administrative code enforcement level. And so there would be fines imposed, and there would also be an option that staff could bring to you a revocation or modification of the PC ordinance, and that process would ultimately come to you. So you would be considering whether the violation is sufficient enough to revoke the PC permit.
Vice Chair Keller, do you want to speak to your motion?
I think I've spoken enough on this, and I hope that we can. Let me just say quickly, I think that in general this has been an excellent project, and I appreciate all that the applicant has done to build this project and to try to create the grocery store for the community. I think my guess is that we're all in agreement as to this project should move forward, and that the entire project should be built, and that the building should be rehabilitated. What we're arguing about is the consequence for the demolition, and that was not according to what the original PC said. So I just want to clarify that. So I'm assuming that even those who might decide to vote against this motion probably are, I would assume, are still in favor of moving forward. Thank you.
And I have no further comments. Maybe we could just have a vote on the motion. Commissioner Pinelli.
I would like to make a friendly amendment to what you put forth. I'd like for us to say that we will recommend this to council, but that the decision about where to apply this public benefit will leave them up It's up to them whether it goes to the sidewalk or to the historic preservation. We'll let them make that decision. Because then it gives the neighbors a chance to provide their commentary about what they want. Because one of my concerns is that the benefits are not, we're going to see these benefits in some other part of town, and I'd rather see that neighborhood get the benefit.
How about if I deal with this way, that staff should survey, I'm requesting that staff get some information about the neighbors in the vicinity and see whether they support the building of the sidewalk, and if so, then report that as an option to council. Is that acceptable to you?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll just make one comment. This is scheduled for an early October council agenda,
Right.
so we'll do our best to get something out. We'll send our regular notice out related to it, but I can't say with confidence we're going to be able to have any type of adequate polling of the neighborhood. And we did send out the notice, and we haven't had much comment on it. So
My suggestion is that for the houses along Edgewood Road, Edgewood Drive, that go from this property to where West Bay Shore crosses over the bridge to East Palo Alto. But basically, maybe a postcard be sent to them whether they have any comments or objection to having a sidewalk installed.
that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call for a vote. Commissioner King.
Sorry. One question I have is, will council see the graphic that we're seeing now that has the two proposed potential benefits? Will
Yes, I'll
council
make sure
see
they're
that?
provided
So they'll
that.
know that these were options we discussed?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then my comment I wanted to bring up, and I'd like to actually address this to the applicant, is I believe that in the council's addressing of this issue that you had to stop building 4 of the houses, and then you had to incur the expense of the SCRR. So I believe that could be considered some form of penalty, that there were costs incurred by the applicant for those. And if I were the applicant, I might want to make some estimate of those costs when you address the council when this comes up before them. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay. So I think we're ready for a vote on the motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? So the motion has passed with Commissioners Pinelli, Vice Chair Keller, Chair Michael, and Commissioner King voting in favor, Commissioner Alchek opposed, and Commissioners Martinez and Tanaka absent. And we'll take a 5-minute break. Item on the agenda is the parking exemptions code review, where the PTC will review and recommend to the City Council whether to adopt two ordinances, an ordinance amending Chapter 1852 of Title 18 to eliminate the exempt floor area parking exemption, and secondly, to adopt an interim ordinance to amend Chapters 18.18 and 18.52 dealing with the downtown commercial district and parking and loading requirements to eliminate certain parking exemptions within the downtown area. And we'll begin with the staff report.
Thank you, Chair and Commission. Aaron Ackman, Interim Planning Director. So I've been with the city for a little bit over a year now, and I can tell you that the zoning code, and particularly how it relates to parking, is very complex. There are a number of provisions that were adopted over time, and a lot of those provisions were adopted in the 1980s. And what happened during the 1980s was there was a downzoning of almost all the properties within the downtown area and other areas within the city. And at that time, it appears that there were different concessions and compromises made within the code. And some of those were exemptions for parking that were really there to provide incentive to property owners to develop within the downtown area. Well, as the Commission knows now, there isn't a need for much incentive. A lot of development is going on downtown, and the parking issue is in the forefront of the public conversation right now. So last year, over a year ago, the council asked staff to take a look at various parking exemptions within the code. And Curtis Williams, who was the director at that time, pointed to one particular parking exemption, which was called the 1-to-1 floor area exemption in the downtown area and the 0.5 floor area exemption in the Cal Ave area. And what that exemption allowed a property owner to do is essentially park an equivalent amount of a floor area amount equivalent to the lot size without providing parking. So in the downtown area, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, the first 10,000 square feet of building would not have to provide parking. In October of last year, the council voted on a moratorium on the use of that. This is now before you tonight as the first part of the code revisions where we're recommending that just become a permanent part of the zoning ordinance, that go away. And that would impact the downtown area as well as the Cal Ave area. So that's the first part of the zoning code amendments that are before you. The second part is somewhat unique, as we're proposing the second part to 4 provisions within the code as an interim ordinance that would be good for a period of 2 years. So the first part of the interim ordinance that's before you, the Commission has heard of TDRs, transferable development rights. Currently within the code, if you historically rehabilitate a building within the downtown area, you're allowed to have either a 2,500 square foot bonus on site to construct without providing parking, or you could take that bonus and transfer it to another site. You could also have another 2,500 square feet that allows you to, if you seismically retrofit a building that's within a certain category, also to build on site or to transfer off to another site. And that's good for both you not have to provide parking as well as a bonus floor area ratio over what's allowed and under the base zoning. What staff is proposing tonight is that TDRs and bonuses still exist, but they only exist as they relate to floor area ratio, that the parking component of those go away for this interim period. So that's the first provision. Second provision, we have something called the minor floor area bonus, which allows a 200 square foot addition or the first 200 square feet of a building to not be parked. This was another one of the compromise codes that was created within the 1980s. So this 200 square foot one, we're proposing that incentive is no longer needed and that go away as well. Now, the third one is one that I really think that should truly be an interim ordinance and be something that we think about and that we take a look at over the next 2-year period. And that's grandfathered buildings and the ability to rebuild grandfathered floor area. So there are a lot, as the Commission knows, there's a lot of buildings that are older within the downtown area. And currently, as it goes, if they are grandfathered, they're built before 1986, and let's say they don't provide any parking on site, they're above the floor area ratio, you could tear down that older building and rebuilding it with a modern building. Now, from a standard practice, that is a good thing. You want the ability to be able to have buildings modernized and be created for modern uses. You don't want to be in a situation where you have a dilapidated building stock 10, 20 years down the line because there's so much value captured within that existing building, and you just wouldn't be able to make it pencil to tear it down if you had to meet the current zoning code standards. However, the reason that we're proposing this as an interim ordinance is we know that there is some type of, there could be some type of impact related to modernizing buildings, but in particular how it relates to parking. So when you take an older retail building, tear it down, and maybe make it partially retail and higher end office space, there could be a greater impact in terms of parking. Now, most of these property owners have paid into the assessment district, so there's still rights associated with that. However, we want to be able to quantify the impact of building modernization so that there could be a proportionate impact fee associated with modernizing buildings. So that's the third one. The fourth one is an unusual code that's found, which says most of the buildings were assessed in the mid-1980s to create parking structures. If you had a part of your building that was vacant at that time, but being used for non-residential vacant space, it was not assessed. However, if that space was in existence, you're still allowed to tear it down and rebuild it with its grandfathered status as if it were assessed. So we're saying that portion of the code be done away with on an interim basis for the next 2 years as we start a downtown development cap and other studies. So those are the main points. You will see that there's a number of projects that are in the pipeline that at least take advantage of a portion of these. Staff isn't entering a recommendation about what to do with those, but what we are saying is the previous decision from the council as it related to the one-to-one FAR moratorium is that the moratorium applied to projects that had not been approved yet for their planning entitlements. So if they were in the pipeline, had not been approved, they were not allowed to take advantage of that moratorium or of that exemption anymore. They did have to provide the parking. So there's a number of people in the audience tonight, and I know we've received emails that this isn't going far enough. I would say that this is a first step. This is the first time that we're really taking a look at the code and recommending changes to the code in several decades. So it is a big step. And during the downtown development cap process, and perhaps even before then, we'll be able to dive deeper into the parking code, into the zoning code to see what's appropriate. So at this point, I could take any questions from the Commission.
So thank you, Director Acton. So at this point, we'll turn to the Commission with any clarifying questions of staff, up to 5 minutes each. Commissioner King?
I'll ask, I was a little bit confused, or I was confused by your tables, particularly, so can you walk me through that and just with particular care towards Table 1? I think you're saying those have parking exemptions. We're not even arguing about those. Those projects will be under the old rules or rules as they stand today. And then Table 2, what that means, and particularly not applicable. I was confused by what not applicable means under building permit status.
So Table 1, 135 Hamilton is really the only one that's in the building permit process. 611 CalPER, that did have its planning approval, so if you were to use the precedent that was set during the last moratorium, that would still be allowed to use the existing zoning code provisions. 240 Hamilton all the way down, those have not received planning approval yet.
And so under staff's recommendation, they would now be under new rules and would lose the exemptions?
Well, we're not actually entering. I think this is a larger policy discussion that we have to have both with the commission and with the council. But what we are saying is that the most recent precedent that has been set by council on the moratorium itself is that it applied to everything that had not been approved from a planning standpoint.
And that would be 240 Hamilton down
on
through
down.
your tables?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question I had is regarding, let's see, let me flip over here. Let's see, on number 3, page 5, grandfathered uses and facilities. So this remodel or improve, I'm curious as to how much gamesmanship can happen there. I know with single-family residences, people to maintain typically setbacks or their property tax base will do a remodel and leave one wall up, and I've actually seen projects in Palo Alto where then that one wall gets taken down after a certain phase of inspection, and so it's basically completely new construction. And so how do we determine the details of who determines whether it's a remodel or a rebuild?
The standard practice for non-conforming structures in the residential zones is that they need to leave 75% of the walls in place as exterior walls to be considered retaining their non-conforming status. For commercial buildings, the practice has been 50%. So retaining 50% of the walls. That's a practice, a policy. It's not a code provision.
Okay, so to me that sounds vague, that people could, again, you could basically rebuild the thing and just go through a slight pain of leaving up those walls, the studs only, and then you rebuild everything around it. So am I wrong? But it seems like it's ripe with the capacity to actually do a rebuild while calling it a remodel.
I guess the definition of what a wall is, I mean, for the residential, policy that we have in place, we do say that you have to leave a siding. It can't be a see-through wall. It can't be just studs and be considered a wall. For commercial, we could have a tight definition, a tight policy of what we consider to be leaving a wall, how much of the wall. That can be done as an administrative policy.
Okay, that would be my concern and suggestion, was that we are very tight on making sure that those two things are clearly separate. And then the other question I had is regarding the transfer development rights. So can you explain, so those can be sold to a third party, or kept retained by the owner for one of their other parcels? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's called bonus floor area. It can be used on site unless, and it can be transferred to an eligible site. It cannot be a historic site that it's transferred to. Those are not eligible for receiving those bonus floor area transferred rights. But yes, it can be transferred to other sites owned by other people, and there's a process in our code that lays out how we go through that process. Okay,
and then my other question, and that transfer development right consists of both entitlements for square footage. You could get more square footage on the parcel to which it's transferred, as well as parking benefits or exceptions, correct?
Right, so you might be transferring more than 5,000 square feet of floor area, bonus floor area, to a site, but you can only get up to 5,000 square feet of parking exemption.
Okay, and
of that floor area.
Chair, may I finish on this question? And so then my question is, so it seems to me if you're saying that those are going to retain, they're going to be maintained exactly the same, that if you compare that to, let's say someone had a building site and they've owned that for however long. Now we're going to say, oh, we're actually now stripping from that the parking exceptions. So you're going to lose those parking exceptions on an existing site that hasn't been applied for permits. I own a building, let's say I own a building, and it currently has, under our current code, there are exceptions for which I might be eligible for parking, that 1-to-1 FAR. We're now talking about removing those from if I own that parcel. So I'm a little confused on if the TDRs contain both square footage and parking benefits, why I would lose mine as a property owner of an existing parcel, and yet the TDR owner would not lose those parking exceptions as well.
So because we have a process to transfer that bonus floor area on both ends, right? So there's the process to send the transferred area and a process to receive the transferred area. When we go through the Architectural Review Board process, it's documented, where that there's transferable rights that are being, excuse me, placed upon that site. When there is a historic rehab or seismic rehab, or both in some cases, that's documented through a legal document as far as how much floor area can be transferred off the site. And then at such time as it's placed onto the new site, it's documented through the county recorders. It's very formal and legal that way.
Okay, and Aaron.
Can you just repeat was she able to answer your question there? Can you repeat it?
Mine's about the parking exception portion. That it seems like we're saying there's a reference in here that would be takings if we stripped from somebody's TDR, if we stripped out the parking exceptions.
No. So I think what I should have said in my presentation, if someone's historically rehabilitated their building and earned and recorded that right to that, they still get that. That's not being taken away as part of this proposal. What we're saying is that we suspend the ability to create the bonus associated with not having to park square footage in the future, whether you historically rehab your building and try to add on to your building unparked, or you try to transfer that off of your site to another site. So it's the same whether or not you're trying to keep it on site or you're trying to sell it to another property owner.
Okay, my time is up, but it seems inconsistent. It seems that we're penalizing, it seems inconsistent that the same parking wouldn't be stripped from an existing parcel or from a TDR, but that's, we'll continue the discussion later. Thank you.
Commissioner Alchek?
One of the components of the interim ordinance would be to study or quantify the effects of this concern about locking property owners into older buildings. How do we, I'm curious to know, like, what's our strategy of quantifying that in the interim? Is it just a matter of how many fewer remodels we get compared to a typical year, or?
No, I think it's just taking a look historically of when we've seen older buildings turn into newer buildings, what has the impact of that been? So when we've seen older retail buildings turn into newer office buildings, how many more occupants are associated with this newer office building than the previous buildings? And the parking impact associated with that.
Okay. I need to think about that for a minute.
Commissioner Pinelli, did you have any questions at this stage? Vice Chair Keller?
Yes. Thank you. So the first question is, what is the downtown FAR that's allowed if you don't get any bonuses or whatever?
So for a mixed-use project, you can get a 2-to-1 FAR for a brand new building parked. With transferred floor area, you can get it up to 3-to-1. If you have an existing building that's already at 2-to-1, let's say it's all commercial, you can still transfer, because it exists, you can still transfer development rights to that building to get it up to 3-to-1.
Okay, thank you.
1-to-1 above what exists in the downtown, above what exists or what is allowed. So.
Right, thank you. So one of the things interesting is that in some sense, we need to, we can think about separating the idea of what people can build from what people have to pay for parking. In other words, right now we've linked those together, but it might make sense to think about possibly separating them. And towards that regard, in terms of the buildings with vacant space, the old buildings with vacant space, that space was never assessed. Is that right?
Correct. In that particular provision, that space was never assessed.
But for a grandfathered building that was larger than zoning allowed, that space was assessed?
Yes.
Okay. So, and the assessments are an annual assessment to pay for the bonds, is that right?
It's an annual assessment unless the owners are permitted to prepay. And so if they don't elect to prepay at the beginning of the assessment, then it goes to an annual assessment over, I think it's a 30-year cycle, but we're well into that cycle.
So they either pay annually or they pay at the beginning, but essentially that's an ongoing payment. Okay. And does such a payment to create a new bond for a new garage requires a 2/3 vote? Is that right?
Of the assessment district property owners, yes.
And does each one get one vote, or how does it work? Is it by parcel? Is it by dollar amount? How do you actually calculate the votes?
You know, I'm not sure. I think it is by property owner.
So by parcel?
Each parcel gets one vote, I believe.
Parcel. Thank you. And that's only the commercial properties, not residential properties that are voting. Is that right?
It depends on how you set up the assessment district. There are
Okay.
a number of different ways to do that. But in downtown, we only have a commercial property owner assessment district.
Okay. And is it possible to create a Melrose district for downtown parking assessment?
Yes, it is.
And would that require a majority vote, and a majority vote of whom?
I believe that Melrose is also 2/3 now, but I would have to check on that. And again, it would be a 2/3 vote of whoever is in the district. The one benefit of a Melrose is that you don't have to have a completely congruous district. You can have little pockets, and they don't have to be congruous.
Okay, thank you. So the interesting thing is for the grandfathered property, they've paid into the assessment district already. So what are we allowing and not allowing? To explain how the grandfathered works in this environment.
Currently or proposed?
Currently and proposed. Explain the difference between what's happening.
So currently, if you have a building and it's above the allowed, FAR, it's grandfathered in. So let's say currently you're allowed to have a 5,000 square foot building and you have a 10,000 square foot building with no parking. You're allowed to tear down that building and build the exact same amount of square footage without providing parking. As we're proposing it now, during this 2-year period, you could renovate your building, you could remodel your building, you could continue to use your building as is, and continue to receive the same parking benefit by being paid into the assessment district. But you wouldn't be allowed to, just during this 2-year period, tear down your building and still keep your grandfathered status to go up and beyond the FAR that's allowed right now and parking that's allowed right now.
So when you say, can I finish this?
Yeah.
So when you're exceeding the FAR that's allowed, could you give me an example? Are you saying that the FAR is above 2.0? Is that the idea?
There's some cases, but it's mostly the situations where, maybe you have 7,000, 8,000 square feet of building without parking on site, or you have, an 8,000 square foot building where 5,000 square feet of FAR is allowed on site.
So for example, if it's not mixed use, if it's all commercial,
yeah,
then what's the maximum FAR if you have all commercial? I mean, on 1-to-1.
Yeah.
So if you have no retail, you only have, is retail and commercial considered mixed use?
No, when we say mixed use, the housing component allows you to have 1.0, and then the commercial component would be also 1.0, so that should make it to your 2.0.
So if you have no housing, then what's the maximum?
1.0.
So if you have no housing, it's 1.0, and if you have housing, then it's 2.0.
Yeah, and then you're allowed to transfer up to another 1.0 using TDRs onto your site. So that's how you could get up to the 3.0 max.
Can that be?
Okay. So then what happens is that if you have no housing, the maximum is 2.0 FAR. You can't go to 3.0. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And if you already had 2.0 in your grandfather, could you go to 3.0 without adding housing?
Yes, with the TDR.
With a TDR. All right. Thank you.
So we're going to open the public hearing now, and we have a number of speaker cards. Vice Chair Keller will announce the speakers, and you'll each have 3 minutes.
Thank you. The first speaker is Ken Elsman, to be followed by David Kleinman.
Did you guys really read this whole thing? It's amazing. It took me quite a while to get through most of it. I have questions. I think one of the things that needs to be changed is the CEQA process. It's used in a sense as a mitigation for CEQA on this. The way the CEQA is currently handled, every project in town, downtown, has been approved with no significant impact. It doesn't make any sense to me that we got to this place with no significant impact. A clarification on who gets excluded. These projects that are in this list can all be included in a moratorium or in the code, including 135. They will add another perhaps 400 or more cars in parking in the neighborhood. This is not an issue about the code and the commercial as much as it really is inherent in the need to address serious problems with destruction of our neighborhoods by commercial parking. On the assessment district that Mr. Keller mentioned, I just want to indicate that the square foot assessment on commercial is less than 10 cents per square foot per month against $7 a month rents, and that is generally paid by the tenant as a part of the triple net rents. When the assessment district was formed, it was formed on the basis of one parking space for every 250 square feet. But they only built, that would have required 9,000 parking spaces. They only built 900. So they're 10%, they built 10%, that's what they're paying for with their 10 cents. As a resident of Professorville, and in light of your initial discussion for the first hour and a half about historic preservation, I think that a major environmental impact report needs to be done because you are in the process, you, the City Council, the downtown businesses, of destroying a National Register historic district, which is referred to as Professorville. That has never been mentioned in a single CEQA document related to any development downtown. Please excuse me for being so upset about this. I've been at this for 10 years, and it's amazing. I really think you need to stop all approvals of all projects that have not begun construction. If they got a permit, good for them. They can hold it for the next 3 or 4 years until they can solve the parking problem. The only way you're going to get these developers to the table to talk about real solutions is to stop giving them these subsidies.
So thank you, Mr. Elsman. Next speaker.
The next speaker is David Kleinman, to be followed by Nielsen Buchanan.
Good evening. I agree with many of Ken's points on the fact that we have a parking issue. On the other hand, I have a slightly different viewpoint, being the owner of some downtown office buildings that will be redeveloped. One of them is one of the buildings on the list that is in progress, 636 Waverly. And I would be very directly and very negatively impacted by the adoption of these moratoria. Specifically, I was told when I lost the first moratorium that's in effect, which is the 5,000 square foot exemption. I went from a building that had 5 or 6 parking spaces to 21. I've been able to accommodate those via engineering and design on site. I don't have approval for that yet, and I'm very concerned that there might be a permanent moratorium that'll turn into or something that'll become permanent before I'm able to get that project, finally approved. I think that we have a parking problem, but I don't think we should start limiting property rights, which is really what people who are upset about parking are asking you to do. I think that we should solve the parking problem by building more parking in the downtown area, more parking garages. And I think that there should be permit parking so that people that are upset stop turning up the volume and perhaps asking you and the city council to limit property owners' rights in the name of solving the parking issue. So I'm in favor of more garages. I'm in favor of developers who are building new developments parking on site, but I don't think that when people like me spend millions of dollars to buy property and then hundreds of thousands to millions engineering developments, go through that process, have certain realistic, I think, expectations, and then lose those rights midstream. I think it's bad planning. I think you want certainty. I think the reason Palo Alto is so great is because certainty was there up until very recently, and I think we'll all lose if we lose that certainty. Thank you.
I believe Vice Chair Keller has a question for you if you'd like to stay for a moment.
Yes, I'm just wondering if the project that you're proposing to build is fully self-parked, or if you're relying at all on the parking exemptions or things like that.
No, it's fully self-parked. I am relying on something that hasn't been brought up and hasn't been lost yet, which is some shared parking. It's a mixed-use building. There is a provision in Palo Alto's code, like virtually every municipality around the country, where there's a shared parking benefit because exactly our situation, we're going to live in one of the 2 residential units. Whoever we sell or rent the other unit to typically would drive outside the building to work, and people that work in the commercial portion can use those spaces, and there's a formula that's widely accepted, same one used. And we will take advantage of that, and that does reduce our total required parking from, 24 to 21 or 25 to 23. I forget the exact numbers right now. But otherwise, through the use of parking lifts, we will be fully parked, and I think we're one of the few projects in Palo Alto where that would have ever occurred. I mean, in a lot that's half the size of this area, we have 5 parking lifts, 4 cars high. So it's pretty extreme.
So if there were a moratorium, and I'm not saying there should be or would be, it sounds to me like you would suggest that fully parked projects be exempted from such a moratorium. Is that what that makes sense to you?
Yes, and I would say that as another example, the 200 square foot bonus, we are taking advantage of that. We would need to redesign our building after having spent literally almost $1 million on design fees and engineering to get it to work. At the point where we're going to apply for a building permit while we're still going through the process of approvals, let's say we lose that 200 square foot exemption. All of a sudden, we're 1 parking space short. And it doesn't seem like much, but it's a big deal, re-engineering a building when you're midstream. So I would say if you're going to pass that, at least allow some period of time that's at least 1 to 2 years, because that's really how long it takes to plan and get a building approved in Palo Alto before it goes into effect. So the people who are in the planning process now, like me, don't go through the process and tell their engineers and architects, hey, assume we can use the 200 square feet. They'll know, hey, we can't. They'll design buildings. Those will get approved. it's a level playing field, and, you know, people go in with a reasonable set of expectations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Nielsen Buchanan, followed by Jeff Levinsky.
I know you're tired of hearing from some of us so frequently. I am not against development. I don't mind if you use eminent domain and build proper parking garages 70 feet tall and to do it right. I don't mind if you build a new Channing house that's 10 stories tall. There are a number of things that are going to have to change in Palo Alto, and it needs to be planned for my grandchildren, not for me. It seems to me that the wheels of progress are beginning to turn in terms of the council and the leadership throughout the city, recognizing we've got some severe traffic and parking problems, and we're severely overcommitted on development versus the impact of parking and traffic. I don't need to go into all that. Pat Burt waxed on quite nicely about the need to have cumulative traffic studies, that just project by project wasn't working out any more than parking negative impact project by project has dug a great big hole. So what are we doing about it? Fortunately, I do see the wheels of progress turning. There's a foot's on the brake, trying to slow things down on certain things. There's remedies being offered to the neighborhoods for permit parking. But when I look back at it and I'm the one that's been trying to quantify, well, what impact will this have? Just stayed up last night just thinking about what is the downtown north impact. Is that 400 workers being displaced and going to have to park somewhere else? I think this is a great chance to really quit digging the hole deeper. It's a great time to put a moratorium. Moratorium will bring everybody to the table, as it should. And why don't we really understand how much of the foot's on the brake, how many feet are on the accelerators, because traffic, parking is simply an imbalance. And for the life of me, I can't figure out what is it going to get better or worse. The things that can make it worse take a long time. The things that can make parking worse take a very short period of time. To make things to get fixed take a long time. Thank you.
The next speaker is Jeff Levinsky.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. It's great that you are reviewing this item tonight, because as you've heard, the parking situation is already a crisis and it's just getting worse month by month. However, the staff report chose to focus on some of the exemptions that cause underparking, but unfortunately, the moment that those are cut off, the developers will just switch to the many other exemptions that litter the code. So I and others are concerned that any piecemeal approach is not going to work. For example, the staff declined to propose a moratorium on the in-lieu fees that many developers downtown can take advantage of. The in-lieu fees do not turn into parking spaces. In fact, the city's own analysis for building a garage on Lot P from just a few months ago shows it costs over $90,000 for each new space, and that's before you factor in land costs and taxes, which are immense. Yet the city currently collects less than $70,000 for each in-lieu space. So if the staff proposal is adopted as is, expect developers just to switch to paying in-lieu fees, and consequently we'll have an even greater shortage of parking with yet more cars clogging the neighborhoods. If the city ever decides to build the garages, guess who will have to pay the difference? It's not going to be the developers, it's going to be the taxpayers. That's right, we're going to end up subsidizing the developers, and that's what the staff proposal leaves in place. That's just one of the loopholes. You could sit here all night tonight and be here for years and argue over how to plug every exemption in turn. Every few months, the staff will come back and say, surprise, developers just switched to a different one, and now we have to plug that one. And all the time, the parking problem will grow and grow and grow and become even harder to solve. Enough. Do not lead the city down that hopeless path. The only solution that makes sense is a moratorium on all underparked projects across Palo Alto, and all the exemptions, all the special rules, all the waivers, all the giveaways. If you want to build it, you need to park it. Thank you.
So now we close the public hearing and come back to commission. In the first round of comments, commissioners, please use up to 5 minutes. Who would like to start? Commissioner Pinelli.
I'd like staff to comment directly on a couple of the items that were actually in Mr. Levinsky's email and signed on by several of the other members of the community, specifically the item about in lieu fees and number 2, the mixed use allowance. Can you provide a little bit more color about how the in lieu fee is calculated in the past and maybe how the thought is how that's going to be in the future?
So regarding the in lieu fee was established a while back, and it was basically just an estimate through engineering of how much it would cost if you had a sizable parking garage built on a per space basis. And I think it was based on our most recent construction of garages and then escalated by a certain amount. So that's how we came. And it's still a pretty accurate number overall. The Lot P did come in at a little higher per space. It actually came in lower per space when you considered the subsidy that would be given by the private-public partnership because of the lot size. When you get a bigger lot, there's less space dedicated to ramps, so it goes down. So that wasn't the most optimal space if it wasn't a space for a lot, if it wasn't a public-private partnership.
But I want to just be clear, because what I'm hearing is that there is no inclusion or of any amortization of land cost as part of that. It's just the cost of construction of an average space. Yeah.
Have an average incremental space above what is already on that, above that parking lot. So if you replaced 100, if you had a base of land that provided 100 spaces and you did a 600 space parking lot, you'd only get credit for that 500 space delta. So it doesn't consider the land cost itself, but it does consider the base amount of parking within that land.
But ostensibly, shouldn't it consider some land cost if we're basically saying, here's a fee you can pay to build a space somewhere else?
I mean, it could, but I mean, I'd honestly want to come back with you, since that wasn't really the subject of tonight, but that's something we could bring back to. There was a lot of work that was done in the past, even before I was here.
And let me give you just an explanation of what's going on in my head. And this is something, since I've joined the commission, I've been harping on, which is one-time costs for permanently entitled benefits. And I've got to think that we're not capturing the full cost with these in lieu fees. We're not capturing land cost, and we're not capturing ongoing maintenance costs. So if a parking garage is dilapidated in 100 years, that property owner already has that fully entitled right to what they got 100 years before, but somebody's got to pay for replacing that parking garage at some point, right? Or at least maintaining it, repairing it. So I think there's a problem, there's an inherent problem in the in lieu fee process. And I think if you really want to solve the problem, make the in lieu fees more expensive than just providing the parking spot, and voila, I think you'll start seeing all of a sudden property owners building or parking their own buildings. So that's on that. The mixed use allowance, I am sympathetic to Mr. Kleinman about, you want certainty. I absolutely am. And I understand that there are plenty of government bodies that have adopted this mixed use allowance. But that is an old paradigm when people actually left their homes and went to work somewhere. I'd venture the guess that many people on this commission here actually work out of their homes. And so I'm not sure that this concept of, shared parking based on this assumption that some people are going to be gone during the day and others are going to be gone during the evening. I just not sure that's really reality anymore. I mean, some of these folks at startups who occupy some of this office space are working 16, 18-hour days, so they're there or they're stay the night, because they're doing an all-nighter. So I think those two items, I think the email from Mr. Lewinsky really needs some attention paid to it. But in general, I'm pretty supportive of what has been proposed in the staff report, and I would like to. I see it as a very good first step.
Through the chair, can I just respond to one thing? I do agree we need to quantify the in lieu fee and make sure that it's the right amount so that we do pay for the maintenance cost that may not be. I mean, typically what you do is you charge permit fees to cover the maintenance costs within these garages. So that's how maintenance is taken care of. But in terms of capturing the value over a longer period of time, I do agree. What I would say as a general planning practice, widely accepted and something I personally agree with too, is you don't always want all spaces provided on each site in a downtown area where there's a lot of pedestrian activity. If you have 50 spaces under each commercial building, you're having a lot of cars going over the sidewalk to access that in an area that you have a lot of pedestrian activity. So it does make sense in some cases to be able to take in lieu fees that do capture the whole amount if you're actually able to provide that parking within a area where people can park once and walk to multiple locations. So it's a balance of both. But I do agree on capturing the cost part.
Commissioner King.
Thank you. So I am, it does resonate the fairness of people at some point in the process and now having to incur additional fees. I'm curious, and maybe the senior assistant city attorney can advise me if we're getting somewhere where we shouldn't be discussing this, but if possible, could staff walk through a sort of a timeline? It looks like what was the date? 2012, October of 2012 was when council enacted the moratorium. So I'm curious if you could, at 636 Waverly, and if you know the timing, where were they in the process? Did we switch things up on them? And how will this vote, if this goes through, how will this impact that project?
So there were two projects that were caught up in the moratorium, which was 636 Waverly and 135 Hamilton. Had applied and drawn plan ups, relying on that one-to-one floor area exemption that they were no longer able to take advantage of.
So at the time, just sorry for interrupting, so as of October of last year, they were moving forward with incurring costs for planning their project.
Yes. So in Mr. Kleiman's, he's further along the line than a lot of people further down on the list. So I mean, he has gone through a lot within this last year, and has worked closely with staff on this, and has made a ton of modifications based on I agree with him. He's one of the few projects that has, been innovative, used lifts to try to do it. We weren't actually aware that he was still using the 200 square foot minor floor area exemption. We'll have to double check that. What he would do in that case is, if he wasn't able to do that, he could do one of two things: reduce his building by 200 square feet, or pay an in lieu fee for an equivalent amount.
Okay, and so those would, if this were to go forward, you're saying the only impact to him would be potential loss or payment incurring an in lieu fee for that 200 square foot exception.
Correct, if he is in fact still applying for that one.
Okay, and can you clarify in lieu fee? So that's an in lieu parking fee? So that would be the impact?
Correct.
And do you know what that would be?
It's about $60,000.
Oh, so it would be one space for that 200 square feet, because it's roughly to the 250 square foot per space.
Yeah, you round up, so it would be one space.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Alchek?
I think that the fact that the staff is recommending these modifications is a good sign. I would support them on that basis alone. But I want to comment on this notion. A few people have mentioned tonight we got to get everyone to the table. We got to force the developers to deal with this issue. I want to suggest that these modifications will affect future property developers. And I think we really want to force all commercial parcel owners, developing, developed, not developing, to the table to help solve this problem, whether it's just to support the solution financially or to help participate in coming up with the right solution. And I think many of us agree that the solution in some respects is to build more parking downtown, and we need to figure out a way to fund that or make it happen. I still believe very strongly that restricting commercial users from using the residential neighborhood streets to park is the best way to do that. Because that's not just going to incentivize the people who are developing right now or wishing to develop. That will make every business downtown go right to their landlord and say, we're not going to make your rent payment next month if I can't get my employees into the store. I can't get my employees in the store unless there's a parking solution. If you don't become part of this solution, then you're going to kiss these $7, $8 rents goodbye. We want to create an incentive for the small number of multiple parcel owners to become the leadership of this initiative. And if they've already developed their parcels, this moratorium will in fact only make their parcels even more valuable, because they will have benefited from transfer development rights, from space that they were able to develop without facilitating a positive impact on parking that new developers will be struggling to meet that sort of same result. And so I'm not suggesting that I don't think we should try this out, but I want to reiterate that if you stop letting somebody park in front of Mr. Buchanan's home, that person will go right up their chain to the person who can make it happen. And I would prefer, and this is going to sound funny, but I would prefer that sort of market-driven approach where we say, I'm not going to tell you how many spaces you have to put on your property per se, how many more spaces you want to put on your property, but if you don't participate in this acquisition of property, if we don't, look, that this notion of parcel owners, I think Commissioner Keller in his line of questions was sort of alluding to this notion that the very people that we'd like to participate in the solution here need to sort of bring it on themselves to some extent if it's going to be the best format. And the only incentive they'll have to do that is if they get pressure up the chain. So again, I'm curious to know if we're just going to put all existing and future applicants at a disadvantage compared to the applicants of the last few years, like in terms of what they're capable of doing with their land. That expectation of what current applicants or potential current applicants have, and their realization that they weren't able to do what maybe their neighbor has been able to do. But really what we want to do is put their neighbor and them in the same boat. And we want to put the business owners in the same boat. And we want everybody to appreciate that we've got a parking problem and we're taking advantage of some of these residential streets to too great an extent. So if they all get together and volunteer and lead the process for, what I feel like, again, is this parking garage solution. And I just want to say for the record, I completely agree with you. I'm in no way opposed to a 15-story parking garage in downtown Palo Alto if that's what we need. And I think Mr. Buchanan's comment that we need to plan for our grandchildren's Palo Alto is incredibly insightful. our height limits are self-imposed. If the parking garage that needs to get built needs to be bigger and taller than it should be. And I think we need to encourage every parcel owner, not just those who are interested in developing from 2013 on, to be a part of this process. So,
Vice Chair Keller.
Thank you. So first I have a question. When a developer pays the in lieu parking fee, do they also pay the annual or whatever parking assessment for all that land as well? For all that villa square footage?
So currently, if they paid a certain square footage, so let's say they paid 5,000 square feet of assessment into it, if they were to propose a new building that was 8,000 square feet, they would have to pay for that in lieu fees for that additional 3,000 square feet.
No, what I'm saying is suppose they paid the in lieu fees. Do they also pay the annual assessment on that square footage as well?
No.
So it's one or the other?
Yeah, or both. I mean, if they have an 8,000 square foot building, they could be paying 5,000, worth of assessments that they had from a previous building that's carried forward into their new building, and then have to pay the delta amount in lieu fees.
What I meant is for any given square foot of building space, you either pay the assessment or you pay the in lieu fee, but not both.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of comments. First of all, there's a concept in economics called the tragedy of the commons. And essentially, this came about because people would graze their sheep, I guess, in the commons. And it was beneficial for people to go and graze their sheep in the commons because you didn't care. You just put as many sheep as you could do there and to graze their sheep. And, but unfortunately, the commons became uninhabitable, and you couldn't put any more sheep there. So the benefit to each individual person of putting more sheep in the commons, it's the individual to benefit, but to the community, it's not a benefit. And essentially what we have here is that downtown north and downtown south are essentially the commons in that regard. So firstly, I agree entirely with the proposals that are done here. Some of these exemptions, a lot of these exemptions were put into place, as far as I understand, in the 1980s. Now, I moved to Palo Alto not as long as maybe Mr. Altman was or other people, but I moved here in 1977, and I remember when I was a grad student here that you could roll up the sidewalks in Palo Alto in the evening because it was very dead. And one of the reasons it was kind of dead is because, in some sense, a lot of commercial usage had gone to the Stanford shopping center. And so incentives are put into effect to try to incentivize development in downtown Palo Alto. But the conditions for which those incentives were put into place are no longer needed and haven't been needed for some time. So therefore, what we need to do, and in particular when I became vice chair, I talked about the potential that we should look at things that are put there because of older conditions. When those conditions no longer exist, we need to change the code to remove the incentives that are no longer needed. Like, for example, housing was, you couldn't get people to build housing in the 80s and early 90s, and then suddenly economics change, and now you can't stop them from building housing. So when economics change, you need to change. When conditions change, you need to change the rules accordingly. And the city is remiss in not having made these changes earlier when they were when the effects that caused these changes were no longer the case. A couple of things. Firstly, the in lieu fees not only need to take into account the cost of building a space now, they need to take into account the cost of building a space when. In other words, if we're not going to build those parking garages for 10 years, you need to take into account the escalated cost of building that parking space 10 years from now, based on construction costs, and then escalate that back down based on the cost of the value you can get from interest in putting that money in the bank for 10 years. And that's the cost you have to charge for parking space, plus any maintenance and whatever that goes in there. So in that case, if $60,000 is the cost of building a parking space, it's not going to be that 10 years from now when we finally get around to building parking garages, if it's 10 years or whatever the time period it is. The issue is that for existing land, I mean, there's a limited amount of land in which we can build parking garages. And so I'm sympathetic with Commissioner Pinelli's comment about considering land costs. I'm also sympathetic with the idea of thinking about what we do with underpark projects, but it seems to me, to the extent that if there were a moratorium, certainly a project like the one that Mr. Kleiman is suggesting, which is basically virtually self-parked, doesn't make sense to proceed on. May I continue, or should we go around for another round?
We'll try and wrap it up.
Okay. So I like the principle of a mixed-use allowance in the large. If you have a large commercial property with a large residential component to it, then statistically it makes sense to have a mixed-use reduction. But when you have 1 or 2 parking spaces, the mixed-use reduction effectively means that you don't have any space for the residential because you don't have the statistics helping you. And you wind up essentially eliminating parking for residential, which doesn't make sense, particularly for people who keep their cars in their houses and take public transit. Some people use their cars only for the weekend and take public transit. That's what we expect to happen downtown. So therefore, we need to think about whether the mixed-use allowance makes sense for onesies, twosies, threesies in terms of housing units. I think not. The next thing is in terms of the requirement that parking be provided at 1 space per every 250 square foot and I think that needs to be updated. And in terms of the transportation element, we got that suggestion, and that's coming forward is another thing that's going to happen and come back to us in the next meeting will be a proposal to evaluate that and figure out what it should be. And obviously we don't put a number in there because it requires an analysis to put a number in there, and the comp plan is, when you put the comp plan in there, you say we want to change this number, you don't actually say what you change it to. So that's what's going on there. Next is that there's a proposal that's being pushed forward by the City Council that I think is very interesting and useful. Unfortunately, there was some sort of disagreement as to what the wording of the motion should be, but there's transportation demand management moving forward. And with transportation demand management, that is going to deal with also not only adding parking, but in terms of what Commissioner Olczak refers to as needing to deal with this with the property owners. And in some sense, to the extent that you can deal with parking by the parking shortage by adding more parking, you can also deal with the parking shortage by bringing in fewer cars. And companies like Google and Apple and other companies have shuttles coming from San Francisco, but the small companies in downtown Palo Alto and some of the other companies elsewhere in the city can't afford their own shuttles coming from different places. So TDM measures can involve bringing in shuttles from San Francisco and other places like that, or East Bay, in order to provide the reduction of the amount of cars that are coming here. So I think that that's also worthwhile part of the mix. Finally, one important part of the problem is that we don't have good data in terms of what the businesses in Palo Alto have in terms of residents, in terms of employees, where they live, how they get here, all kinds of things like that. We don't have any data on that. Now, some cities get that data through a business license tax. However, for some reason, business license tax is very controversial in Palo Alto. But there's no reason why we need a business license tax in order to have a business registry. We could nonetheless have a business registry that gathers all the information we want in a self-serve capacity, where you go up, where all the business owners in Palo Alto have to go to a site, register at that site with the information they need, that the city needs about them. If they register, you get a free downloaded signed secure PDF that says you've registered as a business registry in Palo Alto, free. And if you don't register, then there'll be fines saying you didn't register, or you didn't give the right information, and there are penalties for doing that. And there's standard penalties for doing lots of things like that. And that will allow us to get the data we need, because after all, it's going to be hard to enforce TDM measures in downtown Palo Alto or any of our businesses if we don't have that data, and a business registry is one way to get that data. Thank you.
So it's very clear to the commission and to the council and to others that parking is a major concern in the community, and it's a big problem. I think that the effort of the code review is a tangible but a small step in the right direction. I would like to align some of my comments with Commissioner Alcheck in terms of trying to identify the substance of what the larger problem is, and it's apparent that this targeted effort at cleaning up some archaic parking exemptions in the code isn't addressing the big picture. Although it is it's taken very much in good faith as a step forward. I think that the notion of the problem of the tragedy of the commons was also referred to by Vice Mayor Shepherd recently, and she was referring to the height limit essentially as the commons, as a form of the commons in Palo Alto. If we allow, upzoning to go into the, above 50 feet, we're really taking something which is an asset of the community as part of the commons. And likewise, I think the use of the public streets, including for parking, is part of the commons. And I don't think that as a community and as a city government, we really have a clear sense of what are the implications of that. I've been really struck by the comments from Mr. Osmond and others who in a very rational way put forth a request that the city impose some sort of a moratorium on going ahead with individual projects. And on one hand, I think that that's not particularly feasible. It doesn't seem to me to be, it seems coercive and unlikely to achieve the desired effect of bringing people together in a rational effort at collective problem solving. On the other hand, as a member of the Planning Commission, I've been struck by the difficulty of engaging in completing the long-range planning efforts, amending the comprehensive plan, working on the downtown development cap, the California Avenue area concept plan, or even putting together the residential neighborhood parking permit program that might well be part of the long-term solution. And I see both the Planning Commission and the Council and the staff spending a significant amount of time and energy working on individual projects while the long-term planning languishes. And so I feel very embarrassed by the responsibility that the Planning Commission has of being part of the problem in terms of this inertia and this delay. It definitely complicates our role, and certainly I feel personally the problem of not being able to point to an updated comprehensive plan as a source of the vision, the policy, the programs that guide our decisions. And I can see that this would erode public trust in how those decisions are made and kind of the quality of life in the community as we try to evaluate what we'd like to do into the future and how that impacts some of these planning decisions and approvals. So just as a question for the council, I wonder what it would take to increase the urgency of finalizing these very, very important long-term planning efforts, which are in the home stretch in many respects. And also the question of how the Planning Commission might work with staff, provide a forum for community input, which I think happens on a continual basis, but we could possibly improve in that regard, and working with the council in terms of coming up with, I think, solutions to what are the real problems. So I don't for a minute think that what we're considering tonight is going to address the urgency and the intensity and the magnitude and the reality of the concerns that we're hearing from the community. I think it is, with some implementation questions, it's a step in the right direction, and I would support it. But I don't want to leave any impression that this is, this is going to alleviate what I think is a lack of urgency in doing the heavy lifting on completing the overall planning, which is not addressing the substance of the real problem. So let me go back to my colleagues in the Commission for any further comments and/or a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I recognize this is out of order, and I would appreciate if I could just have 30 seconds for a little clarification.
I'll give you 2 minutes.
First of all, with respect to the in lieu fees, that has been on the books, I believe, for around 10 years, up until the latest building over on Lytton and Alma. The total amount in it was about $100,000. That's how much was collected. I don't believe that there has been much collected since that, except for the new building that's under construction, and that was only because the neighbors started to raise a lot of ruckus about how much parking was going to be there, and an in lieu fee was attached to it. With respect to the assessment district, Art's arguments about paying the full bore, effectively the assessment district, the assessment pays for $6,000 out of the $60,000. It pays for 10% of the real parking need. And I mean, I just, once you get into the numbers, it gets really strange to me. With respect to Mr. Alczek's comments, I don't disagree with you, but we've been fighting for residential parking for 10 or more years. We need every weapon that you can employ to help get these developers to understand the problems they're creating, to get the good developers, and there are good developers around, not greedy, but good developers who want the city to be successful, who want their tenants to be successful, who don't want to put all of the costs on their employees or on the residents, but want to have a profitable, good project in town. So you need all the weapons. You need a moratorium, you need the parking permits, and you need everything you can muster, because you got one hell of a force to fight. Thank you.
So for the record, those comments were from Ken Alsman. Thank you very much. Okay, coming back to the Commission, Commissioner Alczek, would you like to begin?
Sure. So I just want to throw out two things that we can sort of chew on, which is I just reviewed in a non-formal capacity, I had an opportunity to view a project that's getting built in San Jose adjacent to their city hall, where there's 130 plus units with a mix of 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms, and only 1 parking space per bedroom, per unit. So dramatic, potential 400 and something occupants in this residential building, and there's going to be 100 parking spaces. And I mention that because there are different visions for what urban areas are supposed to be. You mentioned this notion of we can provide more parking or we can have less cars. And the second comment, which is going to be very far-fetched, is that I believe in our lifetimes, and there's some degree of range there, but I believe in all of our lifetimes, we will be at a place where transportation is very different. We are already seeing cars that are driving themselves. I love that movie, Minority Report. And, cars latching on to people movers, latching on to each other and moving along. I mention that only because the population of this city is going to continue to grow. But the number of cars may not, or cars as we know it, or the amount of space we need for such modes of transportation is not a necessary increase or riser. I'm not really sure what term to use there. But my point only is that I'd like to believe that in our lifetimes we will see a very different type of transportation evolve in a way that cars have and personal transportation has not evolved in the last 50 years. And other cities are choosing to create situations of direct conflict where you can absolutely see that this building is going to be underparked and the city is saying, yeah, use the bus. And that's a standard of life question for some people, and for other people it's an urban vision. I would just like to suggest that there's this third view, which, you know, in time, transportation solutions may improve to such a great extent that the parking that we have provided may be perfectly adequate for 2050. And I mention that only because in my previous comment I said we have to plan for the city of our grandchildren. And as I sort of thought about that some more, I thought, well, the city for our grandchildren may not need anywhere close to the number of parking spaces we have. So I know they're far-fetched. I just wanted to throw that out there, that this notion of providing your comment where we could either provide more parking spaces or reduce the number of cars that had to come downtown is an interesting one, and that's it.
Vice Chair Keller.
So actually, what I meant to say is that you could do, you could actually add more parking, reduce the amount of cars that come in, or some combination of the two. I didn't mean it was exclusively either or. Just to be clear. So one of the things in terms of your futurism things. One of the ideas of self-driving cars is I think it will deal with traffic, but it won't deal with parking. Because self-driving cars will allow you to pack more cars on a given roadway segment, because they'll move, the turbulent flow that happens with human-driven cars won't occur. But reducing the turbulent flow will allow more cars to flow, and that means we'll have more cars. And in that regard, which is unfortunately the opposite of what we would like. The second thing is that we should not expect the VTA to provide more transit. The only thing we can expect is maybe the 522 bus will run more often, and the 22 bus, I'm not sure, but the issue is essentially bus rapid transit. You know, that may occur. Light rail doesn't seem to have worked as well in Santa Clara Valley. It's more expensive and net ridership has never achieved what it promised. We'll probably have more Caltrains going on here. But essentially, other than that, the only way we'll get more transit in Palo Alto is providing it ourselves. And that's either through increases in the Palo Alto shuttle or increases through transportation demand management where their own shuttles, like Google has done for the employers here. And essentially, the way to reduce both cars and traffic is through these transportation management features on employers, because we really can't provide them on our residents, because there's no mechanism for providing on our residents. Obviously, you can take away parking, but when you do that, you basically get Arbor Real, which has parking imposed, separating into the neighborhood, and I'm not sure that that's any better. They have night impact in parking as opposed to day impact for north and south, north of downtown and south of downtown. So I think we have a hard problem, and maybe things will be great, and then there will be enough transit, and people won't have to have as many cars in 2050. But that's 37 years away, and I'm worried about how we get from point A to point B. And in terms of what we have now, we have too many cars. Parking in places around the neighborhoods where we don't want them. and the residents don't want them. And so we have a bunch of things we need to push levers all the time at the same time to try to squeeze the worms back in the can, so to speak. I'm going to take the opportunity to move staff recommendation. And I think I've given a lot of comments already on thoughts that I had, so I'm just going to simply say that.
Okay. So we have a motion by Vice Chair Keller, seconded by Commissioner Alchek. Let me just comment at this point. So I had, in the last few days, I had the chance to do one of those items on your bucket list. I hiked to the top of Half Dome, and I got up at 3 in the morning, and we started hiking about 4:30 in the morning with flashlights, and took hiking for 11 hours up and down, and it was incredible. So I got back, and I was in my room, had a couple Advil, took a shower, took out my tablet, logged into the Wi-Fi, and there was an unusual article in the New York Times that was by a philosophy professor, and he was talking about the afterlife, not in the traditional religious sense, but he said, there's a lot of things that go on that you do simply because you assume that there will be generations to follow. And like Nielsen Buchanan's grandchildren, I think if we really reject the notion of apocalypse, which I'm not sure we can be confident in that rejection, but if we assume that there's going to be a continued Palo Alto with a continued character of the community, and that there's going to continue to be traffic and parking problems, we're going to have to grapple with some of these problems. And so I'm willing to go so far as to endorse that notion of an afterlife, and I think we have a big responsibility towards some urgency about tackling the problem. I also think that there's a little bit of a confusion, perhaps only in my mind. Palo Alto thinks of itself as a city. I think many years ago it was a suburb. Now in some discussions it's like a little big city or a big little suburb. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But some of these programs that are applicable and are well proven best practices are hard to implement in Palo Alto because of this sort of this hybrid aspect of what makes this place so special. I know in some cities, the cities have stopped having any parking requirements whatsoever of developers. They're just saying, hey, you build a building with no parking, it's going to be less valuable than a building that has parking. So, if that's what you want to do, go for it. You'll eventually learn your lesson, and collectively the community will be better off for just letting the market forces work. But we seem to have the notion that we can do some planning around that, which I think is an interesting, maybe a bit of hubris. Maybe if you have sort of the relationship between development requirements, parking, transportation, you have to assume that if you constrain parking with adjacency to mass transit, that there actually is mass transit that's usable. And that's maybe applicable in some cases to people who are commuting to work. But what about people, like Commissioner Pinelli pointed out, who are very engaged, very productive, professionals, business people, whatever, but they don't commute. And the driving that they do and the parking that they take up is in a completely different pattern of usage. So with all that, I think that the effort that the staff has made to comb through the code and eliminate archaic exemptions is worth our voting on and approving. But I think that the message to the council is to really ratchet up the effort on finalizing the long-term planning, much of which is completely out of date, and it puts the Planning Commission and me in a bind with respect to what what rules we apply to address the concerns of the community. So before we turn it over to the Commission for a vote, I'd like to say that we use a committee, a subcommittee structure in the Commission, and we have recently appointed 2 commissioners to work on a parking subcommittee. I'm asking those 2 commissioners, Vice Chair Keller and Commissioner Pinelli, to come back to the PTC with a specific written proposed charter for what the parking committee will actually do. I think this is probably the most significant undertaking in front of us, with the possible exception of the amendment of the comprehensive plan. And I think this proposed charter of our parking subcommittee should be something we should welcome public input and council direction as to what our parking subcommittee should be working on, and that we should tee up urgently a study session on parking issues, informed in part by the work of our committee along with the staff. So with that, you've made a motion. It's been seconded. Does anybody want to comment on the motion before we vote? Commissioner King.
Thank you. Yeah, I won't attempt an amendment, but I would just like to clarify with staff on my comment regarding the item 2D regarding the remodel versus demolish, that in my opinion, ideally you want clear guidelines that support the intent of the policy, and that if a person reading the ordinance were to look at photos of various projects, they would be able to clearly say, oh yes, this one's a remodel and this one's a demolish. So thank you. I'm done.
Any other comments? So we have a motion. It's been seconded. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously with Commissioners Martinez and Tanaka absent. Okay, and that closes the public hearing. The next item is approval of minutes. According to our agenda, we have none to approve. And then the next item is the director's report.
I could change my title to Director of Parking instead of Director of Planning for this report, given the number of meetings we've had recently related to parking. Last night we had a first meeting to put forward an initial proposal from staff for a downtown adjacent residential permit parking program. The Planning Commission Parking Subcommittee was there. We're having that meeting is with Downtown North. There was a lot of good feedback. We used a proposal that was very similar to a proposal that was given in the year 2000. That didn't go forward at the time, primarily because of cost concerns. We'll also have a second meeting tomorrow night with Downtown South. So we actually expect a little bit bigger crowd, since it's a little bit bigger population in that area. So it should be interesting. From here, after we receive comments, we'll also meet with the business community to gain some of their comments as well. Then send out a survey to both Downtown North and Downtown South, and then bring our proposal along with those survey results to the Commission and to the Council for consideration. So we are making progress, slowly but surely, and I think in terms of what we're working on, I would say about 60 to 70% of the workload within the department is parking related. So that's where the focus has been, based on Commission and Council direction. Regarding upcoming council meetings, on October 7th, the council will be considering approval of the downtown development cap study. Not the study, but the contract to move forward with the study, hiring Diet and Bhatia. This is another really parking focused study. One thing that we had them expand their contract on was to really do a scientific poll of employers downtown to see what the real office density is downtowns, including how many workers per square foot of office space, as well as what is the really mode share of commuters downtown. What percentage are really taking transit, what percentage are really driving in solo vehicles. So we should actually be able to quantify that as a result of the first phase of the downtown development cap study, which would be great because that's some of the data that we haven't had before in order to make decisions. And once we have that, we could dive deeper into the parking code and see what's relevant today. We're also on the 7th consideration of the item you considered tonight, the Edgewood Plaza item. October 21st, the council will they're tentatively scheduled to hear the parking items that you heard today. And they're also not directly related to planning, but probably of some interest. The next building code cycle is on the council agenda for consideration. That happens once every 3 years, and this is the second time that the California includes a green building code, and it's every 3 years it gets stricter and stricter, and there is a lot of innovative things that you could be found within that building code that aren't found within other states. So that's it.
So thank you very much. So we've appointed Commissioner King to be the representative of the PTC to the council in October. Could we get a report from Vice Chair Keller on his representation during September?
Sure. So there was a meeting about transportation demand. The council dealt with transportation demand management proposal, a colleague's memo that was 2 Mondays ago. And there was universal agreement that there should be a transportation demand management program effectively pretty much citywide for the commercial districts. However, there was a debate about the exact wording of the motion. And I think that's going to come back before the council on September 30th, I believe, but I'm not sure if that's the timing that they...
Yeah, it'll be somewhere within the first couple weeks of October, probably the first week of October.
So I would suspect that we'll probably find that sometime along the line, but essentially it's to initiate a process and to do some studies involving that. The second thing is that in the last Monday's session, there was the, let's see, there were a couple of things. There was one thing which was the a proposal to encourage electric vehicle infrastructure in our new construction. It was decided on a policy level that all new single-family units would have electric vehicle infrastructure installed, and for multifamily, mixed use, and commercial, that was a decision that policy and services would consider. I actually gave council some input early Tuesday morning, 3 messages that gave them some input that might be useful to that. I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep, so I wrote the stuff up and then I went back to bed. In addition, I think there was another thing that was on the consent calendar. Do you remember what that was?
There was the Crescent Park overnight
yes.
parking ban.
The Crescent Park overnight parking ban was approved by the council, and there was additional streets that were allowed to have it, and then they would survey the streets. So there was authorized for a certain number more streets than originally, and then the streets those blocks would be surveyed as to whether they want the program or not.
Correct. And the other big amendment to that, based on a neighborhood meeting that the mayor, city manager, and I had, was we're now issuing 2 resident permits per household at a cost of $100 per permit, so that residents of that area can park on the streets at night if they need to. I just got an email that we got the permits in, so we're going to be sending out an email tomorrow as well as a mailer that they're ready for sale.
Are there any reports from other liaisons, subcommittees, or committee representatives? Vice Chair Keller.
The Transportation Element Subcommittee met, and we got a lot of comments from the public, and staff and I went over those comments. I actually came to the meeting in advance with a synthesis of those comments with deltas that should happen with the transportation element. I've gotten back the edits from that process. And I'm in the process of revising that and trying to synthesize that and tie that back to the original comments so that that can then be given to the commission and to the public.
Okay. And I would just add, on behalf of the business and economics element, there was to have been a meeting this week, but because of the absence of two of the members of that subcommittee, that's been put out until the second week of October, I think. So we will report back to you that business and economics element draft has been substantially advanced, and we will make final comments on that and bring it back to the commission. I believe that concludes our Vice Chair Keller.
One thing that would be helpful to do is if somebody could create the list of all the elements and sort of the status of where they are and when and sort of an idea of when they're going to go to the commission and when they're going to go to council. I'm having trouble keeping track of it, and I'm not sure if you're also having trouble keeping track of where things are.
I'm seeing Stephen Turner, Advanced Planning Director, nodding that he will undertake this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? Anybody in favor? We're done.
9:04.
At 9:04.